So I found these yellow springs on a 240 at the junkyard. I thought I'd try them out on here. I'm also looking at getting some progressive coils that were made for an Amazon by a less than reputable person out in New York. But, you know, the product is good when it found its way to those who actually ordered it. So we'll see how that turns out, but this in the meantime, you know, I've had these around and they fit nicely, so we'll see how that all works out. Okay, the fronts are gonna be a little bit easier. We've got the tire and the wheel off. First thing to do is remove this grease cap. Volvo made a special tool for it that goes around and just basically pops it down. But if you could find something big enough without deforming it too much to remove that cap, that would be great. Mine's already kind of dented. See what I can do to save it though, but I'm not sure if it's supposed to stop rolling on its own that much. Yeah, it's just shy of 4 revolutions before it stops spinning on its own. We'll compare that with how it spins freely once it's all put together. I used some big pliers to wiggle it out. You can see it's not much that actually grabs on there. Once I clean it up, we might be able to get it to fit a little bit better too. Inside there, it's full of old grease, and now we can remove the cotter pin and the nut, and that's pretty much going to be all it takes to remove the front hub assembly. This nut is not tight at all. I easily loosened it by hand. The initial torquing of it when you're reinstalling it is just to seat that bearing, and then you loosen it so that there's room for the bearing to move around just a little bit and that doesn't create a lot of friction. There's our first bearing. There's the outer bearing. Looks pretty bare. Pull this out. Oh, it's in much better shape than Shelby's, that's for sure. Clean the spindle. Great. That's pretty much the entire hub right there. Very quick removal. I'm gonna clean all this up so that when we put in our new hub assembly with the bearings repacked and the new oil seal, everything will go smooth. Now is also a good time to clean the backing plate if you so wish. The oil seal sits right around this surface here, so that's also important to clean. So grab a wire brush, get some carb cleaner, or I like brake cleaner. Have at it. Now concerning the hub, I've still got to figure out exactly what's going on here. So this is the seal, I believe. Once we clean it up, we'll see exactly what's going on there. Now this is my first time tearing into an Amazon hub, so I'm learning probably just as much as you guys are. Okay, this is our seal, and this is our second bearing here. Also Steffa Volvo brand. Okay, on the other side, similar situation as the rear in terms of having old grease that kind of clumped itself and dried itself. There's quite a bit in there, so we're going to pull all that out with some paper towels. To remove the seal on the back of the hub, you're going to want to very carefully, and without touching the bearing, grab some pliers, pinch up one of the sides like that, and just pull it straight out. It also is held in maybe 3/8 of an inch or so, and once that's pulled out, the back bearing can come out, and we can clean that up, clean up the hub, and then we're going to send the rotor over to get it resurfaced. Well, now that it's all cleaned up, we can inspect our bearing races, and they also look really good. Again, I have to stress the fact that you don't want to scratch them while you're trying to remove that rear seal. Maybe if you grab some wire cutters or something and you can like pinch around to the point where you're not getting into that bearing, and then just pry it up a little bit, you know, get some leverage off and try to pop it off. But don't pry against the bearing. I guess there's a degree of common sense associated to that, but still it's easy to make mistakes, especially if it's your first time. I've done wheel bearings on S80s. Those are just sealed hub assemblies, and you don't mess with them. They require no maintenance, no greasing. It's just one unit that you pull out and put in. But I gotta say, this is easier in a sense that, you know, it's just a few things to actually take it off of the car, and this cavity is going to be filled about halfway with grease once it's all put back together. Now, I'm not sure if I need to remove these races or not when I go to get these resurfaced, so I'm going to ask, and we'll see. If we need to pull the races, I have a bearing race puller, but I can't guarantee that I'm not going to damage those races, and I don't want to have to buy new bearings, so hopefully they can just resurface this rotor without damaging the bearing by putting it on something that's compromising. Note to self on the driver's side drum for Arthur. I put D's everywhere for driver's side. Okay, today's February 20th. Finally ready to start putting things back together. Here's my Lucas gear oil, the 80W90. People are recommending just a straight 90 weight, but I couldn't find that, so this will work out just fine. Also got the Red and Tacky #2 multi-purpose grease. It's a high-quality lithium and silicate or synthetic something blend. They brag a lot about it on the back of the label. Of course, who wouldn't if it was your own label? And I got some cans of brake fluid, .3. So we're ready to start putting Arthur back together. Here's the black and white version of our green books. I've got Part 1, Part 7, and Part 5. They all cover a little bit of what's going on today with the wheel bearings. And then we have our new parts here. We've got our cotter pins, oil seals for the rear with the gaskets, and the felt rings, of course, and then the oil seals for the front, which are just the newer rubber style. All right. I'm excited. Here we are at our dirty parts washer. We're going to wash out our bearings, make sure that there's no grease left, and then we're going to give them a quick spray with a solvent to make sure there's no purple powder left in there. Make sure that they're completely dry, and we got to be careful not to use compressed air, because compressed air has traces of moisture, which could lead to a little bit of rust, like a flashing surface rust, and that's bad. Here's our final desired product with these bearings. Both of these bearings took about 15-20 minutes to wash. Now, that's because you want to be very thorough. You want every single spot of grease gone from them, from both sides, especially around here. It's going to be a little tricky. You really want to look in there and make sure that there's no old grease. So essentially what you're trying to do with this parts washer is you're trying to break up the old grease using some nylon brushes into small manageable chunks, and then it'll rinse it through the races and through the rollers and all the way out. It's just a lot of rinse and repeat. Spin it until you feel like there's no grease in there, letting it spin. You'll be able to tell it's a lot rougher to spin a bearing without grease than it is one with grease. And as you keep doing that, eventually you're going to find some grease that'll make its way back on top of the ends of the rollers or coming out the top here. So take your time, be meticulous, because you don't want to do this again. So just a few more minutes and double checking will save you a lot of trouble down the road. So this is our passenger side and it's ready to reinstall. Here we've pulled off our backing plate and the bracket which holds the caliper to the spindle. These are also ready to get washed, and this calendar here is brought to you by Swedish Motors in Boulder, Colorado. I'm going to be visiting them again on the way up this summer to Portland when I'll be driving Arthur, not towing. Here's our right side, cleaned up, repainted, and ready for the new parts. Here's our brake disc. It's been resurfaced, and if you remember, it was only about 1 millimeter away from minimal thickness. Actually, it was about 0.8 millimeters. But the resurfacing actually does not take off a lot of material, and it's a non-directional finish, so it could go passenger or driver side, but I'm going to keep it to the right side because of the bearing races that are matched with the bearings. Sorry I couldn't record how to pack a bearing for you guys. You can see it's really messy. There is some tool out there that helps with that, but essentially what you want to do is get you start with the wider side of the race and you stuff it until it starts coming out the narrower diameter side, and then you kind of work your way around and then make sure that it's just kind of oozed through and in between every roller. That's why it's called packing. I'm sure there are a lot of great videos out there, and you guys will be able to find one that can explain it a lot better than I ever could. Here's our new seal for the back of the bearings. We're just gonna tap that one in just like you would any oil seal. Now this seal's not going to fit all the way flush, and you'll notice with the original seal a little bit of a layer there that tells you how far it actually set in. If you go in all the way, what's going to happen is it's going to start compressing that spring on the inside, and it won't let the bearing spin freely, and it's just going to be a big mess. The seal's a pain in the butt to get in, and it was very frustrating, but just make sure that there's enough space for the bearing still to spin. We're going to put a little bit of grease on the spindle, and we're going to make sure that everything is lubricated all around on it. According to the instructions, we have to fill the hub with enough grease till it reaches the inner diameter of the outer bearing ring, which is this one. And so I basically just packed it in all around, and now it's ready to install into the spindle. The hub is attached, and you can feel when that outer ring sort of presses over the back of the spindle. And now we're going to pack our front wheel bearing after we spray it with some cleaner, and then we're going to install that one in the front, put our washer and our nut. Alright, here I can show you a little bit of how to properly pack a bearing. I'm going to pump some grease into my hand, and then you basically shove it into one side until it starts coming out the top. So, like this. Small bits at a time, and then you can see it coming out the top there. So those couple of rollers there are packed, and we're going to just turn it a little bit and keep shoving it in there, just like that. You'd be surprised how much grease these little bearings can take, but you want to make sure that it's packed all the way around and then greased thoroughly inside and out so you don't have any issues later. So now our nut and washer are attached. What you're going to do is tighten this to 50 foot-pounds and then back it off 2 hex flats, which is just one side of the hexagonal nut. So let's say that like this is 50 pounds. Oh, it's tight. And then you go 1, 2, and that gives it just enough play for the bearings to be free and not start binding on anything. And the instructions say that if it's off a little bit, you loosen it until it reaches the hole so that you can put in your split pin or your cotter pin. So if I've tightened it 50 pounds and it's right there, It's like, oh, I could just tighten it a little bit. Maybe that's all right, but the manual says to just loosen it until you get to the next free spot. Hopefully that's not the issue with us though. Now the cotter pin step might seem trivial to some of you, but the Navy likes to disagree. A lot of people will rotate this pin and install it this way so that it doesn't go into the nut. My automotive instructor and the United States Navy prefer that you install it like that and flip one of these to the front and wrap the other one around to the side. That's the maximum efficiency for these cotter pins. I'm gonna trim this top piece here. Check now that this spins freely without much resistance. You don't hear any grinding or smushing sounds. You also don't want to apply too much grease inside of the hub. That could also cause problems if it comes out. Just do exactly what's required. No more. Real nice and real smooth. So I'm happy with that. Our next step is to fill up the grease cap halfway with grease. And then we're going to just tap that in right there. Now you'll notice I'm reusing my grease cap. It's not advised, but if it has a problem, I'll just replace it. There's the inner race, and here's all of our grease. That's hopefully enough to fill it up. It's another beautiful day out in New Mexico, and we are going to be washing our differential cover and maybe paint it a nice color too, because I happen to be that kind of guy. I'll wash it, paint it, find the gasket. It's in one of the boxes I've got back there behind Arthur. We'll get back to putting everything back together on the rear end. So back here we've got to pull out that rear oil seal before we can drive in our new one and install the half shaft. We're going to clean and repaint our backing plate. Here with the rear bearing is a fine example of how the grease comes out the top when you pack it from the bottom. That's how you know the bearings inside are greased all the way up, because you don't want to leave any empty spaces for them to have any problems in the future. And then we're going to set this in back in the rear axle. Okay, here our shaft is going back in. We're going to grease the inside of the surface there, and then we're going to fit our bearing after we stick this in. Okay, there's our bearing back in the rear, and it's all greased up. And here's our bearing race. We're going to lubricate and we're going to tap it in evenly. Some people suggest using the housing to actually stick it in and tighten it down so that it's even. We'll see how well it works out. So here we see the outer race. It's in about 1 or 2 millimeters, and we're going to stick the oil housing on top of that, and then as we tighten it down, it's going to push it in evenly. What's the oil housing, you ask? This piece. We're going to clean it up, take out the old felt seal, and then get our hardware and just tighten it. Okay, now we're going to go over the order of how to put everything back, because you can get kind of confusing, especially if you've had it down for any certain amount of days. First thing is the spacer, if any. This one only has one. The other side is the one that really spaces the play. That's going to determine the play in this bearing. After the spacer is the backing plate. After the backing plate, one of the paper gaskets, the big metal shim, the other paper gasket, and the felt seal housing. We'll just pretend that that's all installed together there. That's how it's gonna look all put together. So we're gonna just start one at a time. I'm gonna use a little bit of RTV here because trying to use this to punch in that bearing didn't really work out very well. Hopefully I don't have any leaks. If you buy a whole new housing for the felt seal, it's going to come already installed if you're just buying a new felt seal. These are pretty much just soaked in oil. I'm going to use gear oil, and then they're pressed in here. And this is like a little retainer cap that you install. You don't have to use much force to get it to click into place, but you'll kind of feel it, and that is your rudimentary felt seal assembly. Okay, here we have our oil seal that is soaking the gear oil. That's my reflection. I'm going to use a little bit of the black RTV silicone in between the junctions for the paper green gaskets there, because I'm not so sure how this old retainer housing here is, you know, if it's flat enough or if it's going to give me an issue. So that should be a little bit of insurance there against any oil leaks. Now that this is all put back together, got my new wheel cylinder next to my old wheel cylinder. The new brake shoes are not going to have this adjusting lever for the parking brake, so punch that out on the back. I just flipped it over the hammer in a drift. And I punch that out. And we're going to install it in here, make sure that it stays tight. And we're going to flare the back side of it just like it was here to make sure it stays in. Hi guys, this is David, and today Ryan is with us. He came all the way from Fort Collins, Colorado to help us with Arthur.
Okay, so we're gonna put these brakes on and these rebuild calipers David set down. I don't know. I assume we got some pads here too as well. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward. 2 bolts that hold the caliper on right there. And then the line goes in there and calipers and Bob's your uncle.